night, it's hard to just kind of sit down and listen to anything. So I like that my same approach as last time is I definitely don't come at this from trying to present you guys with a lot of literature and academia, even though that's my role at Queen's, because I think that with only an hour, it's kind of important that I just impart on you what I've learned as an occupational therapist working in the field of developmental disabilities over the last 12 years, and particularly in autism. And so just so that you know who I am, I'm Meg McQueen. I am occupational therapist, but also the clinical director of the Developmental Disabilities Consulting Program at Queen's University. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry and School of Rehabilitation. And my biggest accolade is that I've got to work on an interprofessional team with psychology and psychiatry and social work and speech and language pathology for all of my career. And so the cross-pollination between different disciplines has been really great in helping me understand more about autism, so that I'm not just coming at it from an OT's lens, but I've got my flavor of OT. So today I really wanted to give you a really basic overview of how our team tends to see sexuality in autism spectrum disorder, and some of the nuances that are there, and some of the overarching messages and themes that we try to bring forward to families that are really trying to get a grasp on this new adventure that your children are embarking on. And how do we put that into context from our own understanding of sexuality and our own experiences, because that is really important. Sexuality is not necessarily that happens in isolation of a culture or a society or outside of a family. There's lots of subtleties that go into it. So I kind of want to address a little bit of all of that. And then also I have one really good resource that I've tagged at the end of this presentation. It is a guide, a manual that comes out of the NHS out of the UK. It is really great for helping parents and caregivers to walk through sexuality from start to finish, whether it's masturbation, whether it is consent, whether it's body parts. It walks you through about how to actually introduce it to your children in ways that are going to meet them where they're at, and also come up with different ideas about how do you introduce this in a way that's going to be applicable and not overwhelming. So I really encourage you at the end of this to look at the link that I've provided on the references sheet and take a look at that manual, print it off if you can. And that is a really good Bible to have for the next however many years your child's going through adolescence.
Sorry, I'm having a hard time hearing you.
Haley, Bob and Karen are saying they're having a hard time hearing me. Is there, is anybody else?
You're good on my end, like you're very clear on my end. So I'm not sure if it's just on your end.
Okay. Lisa mentioned she can hear okay. Sorry, Bob and Karen, if this is coming out staticky for you, hopefully then you can hear the recording.
No, it's not staticky. It's just very faint. I can barely hear you. Like the volume is very low.
Okay.
So I don't know. I can't figure out how to turn the volume up on my side. So I don't know. Sorry.
That's all right.
I'm just having a hard time hearing you. You're clear. I just can't hear you very well.
Okay. I don't really know. If I speak too loud, I just don't want to get too loud for anybody. So Haley, you let me know if I'm speaking too loud or too soft, and I'll try to keep that measured for you. Okay.
You're good.
Okay.
Also, don't forget to share your screen.
Yes. So I'm coming up very soon with my screen. Here I come. Okay. So again, this is just the introduction here. Sexuality in individuals with ASD. This is just who I am, where I work, and a way to contact me below if you guys ever have any questions or want to follow up in any way. So the reason I put this little meme up here is just to underscore the complexity of sexuality. And I think this probably resonates with all of us to some degree, that sexuality and intimacy is no easy endeavor or adventure. I think we all understand that when adolescence hit, what we have sort of pie in the sky, what comes out of movies and books about ideas of romance and what sexuality and intimacy will look like and what it actually ends up being. It's very different, and it's not always based in reality. And so I think I always try to bring it back to what's normal and what's realistic, especially for our folks with an autism diagnosis, is that the subtleties of sexuality and relationships is largely a social interaction outside of sort of the sexual need and desire for reproduction or sexual stimulation. It's all kind of mixed into this gray, muddy mess of then intimacy with relationships and sense of self. So yeah, me flirting, want to suffer together. I never thought you'd ask. This is definitely probably where we're all at some point in our lives. So historically, I think it is really important to know that we are not that far away. We're not that many decades past a time where we assumed all individuals with a disability had no desire for sexuality or intimacy. It was seen as something as a pathology to try to rid that person of that desire, because it wasn't seen as it should be a part of who they were. And that is a really big jump to where we are talking today, where we're saying absolutely sexuality and intimacy are a part of any person's right to exist and to express. And so the culture, just because we've decided now that this is a right and this is something that we should all be promoting, it doesn't mean the culture and society have caught up to that, or that we even have a really good grasp about how to intervene or how to foster and facilitate. Not that long ago, sterilization of women with developmental disability occurred frequently, if not all times, that someone was admitted to an institution to prevent pregnancy, whether they were sexually active or not. This is a reality. Many of our folks are vulnerable to sexual coercion, aggression, and abuse, and there is a long-standing history of individuals being in those situations and not having the autonomy, the ability, or the advocacy around them to prevent this from happening. For decades, if not most of our history, there's been an encouragement for parents to prevent all intimate relationships that their children might be interested in if they've got a disability, to prevent the also terrible thing of pregnancy and the so terrible thing of abuse. So it's almost, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We for a long time, it was don't allow any sort of intimate relationships whatsoever, because we don't know where it's going to end up. Again, a big thing that I think probably in the last decade that we're starting to really assuming that all sexual attraction would be heterosexual, and not recognizing that many folks, whether you have ASD or not, might have multiple attractions to different genders, to different labels, to different looks, to different things. And it doesn't have to be this one size fits all. And I think even today, in the language that way we talk, if someone is going through puberty, we almost always say, if they're a male, we'll say, are they attracted to females, to see if they're sexually, interested. Whereas, if we never ask the question, are they sexually attracted to males? Are they sexually attracted to something? We're just starting to really ask those questions now, and really our language hasn't changed that much, and that's something that we should be pushing forward, because I think that we could do a lot more work in that area. Again, historically, assuming consent issues prevent all sexual interactions. So because someone might not be able to consent to sexual intercourse, does that mean that they can't consent to holding hands? Does that mean that they can't consent to kissing somebody? So there's varying levels of consent across the board, and levels of understanding of consequences and repercussions or benefits, pros and cons. But I think in the past, we've always just said, if there's no consent for the Big Bang, then there's no consent for anything, which I think that there's all shades of gray there. Black or white thinking, which would be if they kiss, then they'll want to have sex. So the over assumption that if somebody gets into a relationship and they have a developmental disability or autism, that if they want to even start to unfold some of that intimate interactions with somebody else, that it's automatically going to lead to more consequential types of interactions, which is not always the case. And if we never really go down that road, then we never really get the opportunity to say, what level of intimacy and what level of sexuality is that person wanting to express? And then I think there's a huge cultural, societal pressure that we're only in relationships to have sex, and we're only in relationship to have body-to-body physical intimacy. And dollars to donuts, there is a lot of marriages out there where there is no physical intimacy happening at all. And it doesn't mean that you don't still want to be with that person. And it still doesn't mean that you don't like to cuddle and snuggle. And it doesn't mean that you don't just love them sitting beside you on the porch. So I think, we come in sometimes with a lot of these ideas and beliefs about what sexuality and relationships are. But a lot of them we're not living ourselves. So these very high expectations about how it's supposed to go. And then our kiddos then have to try to meet these expectations that none of us are fulfilling, or none of us actually maybe believe in. So I think just getting a sense of that historical approach is a good foundation to jump off, because I always want to base us in reality. And that's really where our team comes from, in terms of each child is going to be very different. Each child or youth, adolescent and adult, is going to hit this at their own pace. And some developmentally may never get to a place where sexuality has that societal meaning to them in terms of a relationship or an intimate relationship. It may more be about sexual expression themselves, sexual stimulation, that part of who they are as a human. And that may be the level that that's their performance level and what they get satisfaction from. And then others may take it to a different level where, it's not so much the sexuality piece of it, it's more about the relationship intimacy side of it and what that means to them. And so I kind of enter into this conversation recognizing that each of our kids, each of our youth, each of our young adults is so very different, just like each of us is. Nobody could peg who you are as a sexual being but yourself. And really trying to put anyone, any sort of round hole into a square peg sort of situation, or vice versa. That's not what I'm trying to do here today. And I really hope that, again, that you recognize this is sort of the basics, but that you guys will know your kids best to figure out how do we introduce sexuality in relationships in a way that's going to really benefit them, and satisfy them and help them get to that stage of actualization of the optimal performance, right, and the quality of life. So the big difference here, I think it is really important, especially I have a lot of conversations with people in schools, because schools is where we get into some trouble. In high school, we get into lots of sticky situations about sexuality and intimacy. And what is sexuality? And when someone's expressing themselves through touch or through being close to somebody, we're always trying to find that fine line. Are they sexually attracted to somebody? And so is that becoming inappropriate? And that's making someone feel uncomfortable? Or are they trying to express intimacy, that they're feeling a close personal friendship with that somebody, but they don't necessarily know how to express that? Because maybe they haven't been taught, but also they're seeing lots of blurred lines, right? There is lots of touching that goes on in high school. There is lots of stuff that's happening that we all have been through high school. We all know what you see is not necessarily what you hear is going on. So I think, human sexuality, it's the way people experience and express themselves sexually. This involves biological, erotic, physical, emotional, social, and spiritual feelings. So everybody has a sexual side to them to some degree. The intimacy piece is feeling an atmosphere of closeness and openness towards somebody else, and it's not necessarily about sexuality. And sometimes we intimately connect the two, and that's not always the case. And sometimes I'm often advocating that a youth may be missing intimacy in their lives because all they have is their mother and father for intimacy. And developmentally, teenagers are appropriately supposed to move away from intimacy with their mom and dad. They're supposed to sort of drift towards outside people for intimacy, their peer groups and outside social figures. And so that can be a hard thing for parents to try to navigate, because you're still developmentally maybe assisting or facilitating your child in a very younger cognitive way, but sexually and intimacy levels, they may be needing to flourish a bit outside of yourself. And how do you foster those friendships and relationships in a way that, you know, you don't want your child to fail, but they also do have to fail, trial and error, that's the part of life. It's no easy feat, but I think it's really important when we're advocating, if we're talking to any caregivers or schools around us, that we're very clear what is sexuality and what is intimacy. They're two very different things. A child can have intimacy with their EA that is magical and awesome and great, and it can make wonderful things happen. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they're sexually attracted to their EA. It also doesn't mean, though, if they get an erection, that they aren't. Just like many people could be attracted to their 25-year-old EA. Right. And so that's, I always kind of, like I said, bring it back to reality. We just need to make sure that one is not always the same as the other. So I put this up here, not to say that any of our youths are 2 to 6 years old, but what I really wanted to get down to is normal common behaviors at a very young age. I really want everyone to look at that first category about how normal, you know, masturbation, touching yourself, being interested in your peers' genitals, standing too close to people, wanting to see nudity, being distracted. These are all very normal things that right from an early age, developmentally we're interested in. And even then when we start to move, and then if we start to move over sort of to the less common normal behaviors, these are just more normal behaviors of teenagers, right? And you can kind of see, you know, crude mimic of movement socially, that's absolutely teenager, right? Who hasn't seen that? Rubbing body parts. That's kind of where we start to see developmentally. We shouldn't see it necessarily in a 2 to 6 year old. And then you get over to other behaviors where they're not necessarily typical, right? And it doesn't mean that they're not necessarily typical at a later stage, but I just really want to highlight that at a very young age, we're sexual beings. And for a lot of our kids and folks, they're not really maybe entering that stage when they're 6 years old. They're maybe not as interested. It doesn't mean that developmentally they don't hit that stage when they're 9 or 10 or 11 or 12, and that they might not then catch up with their peers in terms of seeing things and being more interested. And so I really just using this screen to disabuse you of what we say is normal. We should see sexual behaviors from kids. And then we should absolutely see sexual behaviors in youth. That is a very normal, typical thing. And I think you'll see over here some of the caveats down below is that they say assessment of situational factors like family nudity, daycare, new siblings. These can contribute to different behaviors. And then you add things like trauma, violence, abuse, neglect. And then we start to see deviance in what's typical behaviors. So I think I won't delve too far in this. This would be another half-day workshop with our forensic psychologist, Dr. Jessica Jones, who specializes in this area of when we start to see sexuality turn into something that's more forensic, that's got a different flavor to it, that's a bit more troublesome. But what we're really talking about today is just normal, typical sexual behaviors. So first and foremost, I think any parent, any caregiver, if we're talking about sexuality, I always want to know, what does your child already know? Because I bet you, dollars to donuts, they know more, or they think they know more, or they've been exposed to more than what you may think. So I always kind of get parents and everyone to say, okay, what do we think is there already? And so this is a way to walk yourself down some of the questions that you might ask yourself. So how much have you talked about sexual parts? How much have you talked about sexuality? How much have you talked about relationships? Sort of the intimacy circle, right? We've probably all seen the intimacy circle of inside is family, that's they can get close, they can touch your body in appropriate ways. And their second level is friends, and their second level is acquaintances, and lastly is strangers. That would be a good question to ask yourselves. How much have you really actually talked about this stuff out loud in a household? What experiences have been avoided or delayed? This is another one that sometimes we have to be honest. Have we avoided certain conversations, or have we delayed certain interactions because we're not sure that the individual is ready, which is totally reasonable. Potentially the child or the youth is not ready, and they're not interested, right? And so that's also good to make sure that you know where your baseline is. If your child is not interested in these areas, is not showing any proclivities to it, then you might not delve into something if you know that it's not on their radar. But I also always want to know, what have they learned from their peers? And this is a hard one. I've seen so many kids, youth, that in front of their parents in the interview, when we're having the conversation, they got it down that they don't know nothing from their peers. Their peers haven't said nothing. They're not no snitch. And then you get them on their own, and there's the stuff kind of sneaks out, right? The different terminology comes out, and the words that we kind of know, the slang comes out. And I go, there's some knowledge in there. There's some stuff in there that they knew not to bring out in that interview. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they comprehend 100% what they're saying, but trying to dig down to the bottom of what have they learned from their peers is an important thing, because in your youth, peers mean more than your parents do. And that's appropriate. That's developmentally appropriate. They have more weight to them, good or bad or ugly. What have they learned from movies and commercials and TV shows? And this is especially for our kids with autism, who can get really focused on particular movies, songs, themes, and it sticks with them. It's in the bank, right? And they may watch it many, many times. So I have a young fellow right now who's having trouble with kissing people's hands. And but he loves Disney movies where everybody always kisses the princess's hand. So that's really tough. That's really tough, because he's past puberty to some degree, but he's really starting to get interested in women. And everything that's been reinforced in Disney is kind of what we're not allowing, number one, from COVID, but also then personal space, right? About that you can't go up and grab every woman's hand and kiss her on the hand. And he gets positively reinforced sometimes, because some women are like, whew, thank God there's a gentleman left in this world. And other people are like, I don't want that 6-foot person coming over and grabbing my hand unexpectedly, right? So there's this mixed messages of things. So there is a lot of challenges there about what has come in from our culture that maybe our youth, it's in there, and it makes sense to them, and it's been making sense for a long time. And then now, because they're turning into adults, we're saying, no, this doesn't work anymore. So we're trying to put on new social rules without a lot of understanding or context around it, other than you can't do that. So that's a challenge for sure. What have they been feeling? So have you started to notice erections? Have you started to notice nighttime wet sheets? Have you seen certain rubbing or tingling? What are you physically seeing that's telling you that their body is being activated? This is the natural trajectory, and now this is the hormones are flooding. Here we go. What level of interest are they at? So number one, exposure is really important. And this is more, I have to mention this because a lot of our kids may go through trauma of being introduced to sexuality way too early due to abuse. And so when you sexually engage with a child, you activate sexuality way too early. And so a lot of kids that that I may work with who are in the Children's Aid Society may have been in a sexual abuse situation. And then we have that now that that's been activated, even though they may be 6 or 7 years old, you can't unactivate it. The sexuality has started, and that ultimately can play into how much they're interested in sort of the activity. And then developmental age. So where are they at? You may not, many folks may not ever hit that stage where they're sexually interested in another person. They might have sexual stimulation for themselves, but they're not interested in interacting with somebody else to engage in any way, or they might just see it as a means to an end. Other people developmentally from an early age might be really interested in relationships, but not interested in the sexuality piece to it. And then others, have perceptive interests where if they get, a really positive effect from something and they can get kind of stuck on that. I think that's always sometimes a fear for parents, is that if we introduce masturbation, are we going to get a situation where someone is masturbating many, many times per day because of the kind of nature of perseverative interests? That's always a big question. What have they learned that you don't know? And this is, I think, anyone over the age of 30, there's lots of things that I think that I'm in the know, and I'm finding out still stuff about stuff at high schools that kids are seeing on iPads, kids are seeing on YouTube. And I assume that YouTube, we kind of just hand over the YouTube, and especially if there's a typical thing that somebody's looking at all the time and we say, well, they always just look at that. I'm always very much, go through the histories, make sure that you're going through that stuff to know what websites are being accessed, because that's really important. That there's a lot of maladaptive stuff online. And I have seen some cases where a child has come upon a certain types of sexual interaction that I don't think many of us would be supportive of. And it happened by accident, but you can't unsee it. Right. And so I think it is important that we're very aware of what we're handing over in terms of online stuff. And then understanding that they may have sexual preferences that are different than your own. And this is a reality that I think, whether it's cultural, whether it's societal, whether it's religion, whether it's your own upbringing, we also come into with our own biases about what sexuality means. And sometimes that doesn't actually match up with what how that person expresses their sexuality, and that can sometimes cause some conflict for people, which I understand. And lastly, most youth do not want to share their sexual intimate relationship details with their parents, and this is no different. That what you hear from your child is probably, shades of gray here, a little bit of the truth here, and that's natural that they don't want to share that part of who they are with you. And so sometimes that's really great to bring in a third party, a mentor, somebody else that's not mom and dad. This is a great time in their lives to create an organic relationship with someone they can get trusted information from that's maybe not mom and dad. So some of the challenges that we see at DDCP, and this may resonate, some of these might resonate for you, and some of them you might have come across, and others you're thinking these don't apply, but youth wanting sexual interactions but lack of education and consent from the system. This is a hard one, because sometimes we see some 16 and 17-year-olds come in and they've got a real interest. Like the sexuality is kicked on, and they're starting to notice girls in high school or boys in high school, and they don't know how to go about it. They want it, and they've picked up a couple cues along the way about how to do it, but then we have this huge lack of education about how to go about it, and then we have a system saying you can't do that. And so they hit this brick wall of their body, and their brain is saying, this is normal. I'm supposed to let her know I like her. I'm supposed to let them know that this is, we should do this. And then they hit this brick wall of, no, you can't do that. And you're not allowed to do that. And you don't know why. So we see that often a lot. And that sometimes sneaks up on parents, because suddenly they've gone from, public school, and now they're in high school, and grade 9 was scary, and we were all focused on the transition from public school to high school, and are they going to acclimate, and are things going to be okay? Will the EA stay the same? That we kind of forget that high school is going to kick us all in the butt here. And then we get into these sexuality issues, and none of us have been talking about, this was coming around the corner, right? We could have seen this a mile away, but we were just putting out fires for everything else. So lack of access to materials and tools that the typical population uses. We hugely hoard things like, nudie magazines and that kind of stuff, where we're like, we can't give teenagers that stuff, and we can't give them tools, and we can't facilitate sexuality, because there's this borderline. Is it appropriate? Is it not? Are we facilitating sexuality? Are we forcing sexuality? So often our kids can sometimes get in a situation where the only exposure to sexual materials is the environments that they're in. And it might be that the only person that they're allowed to see sexually might be their EA, or might be a caregiver or a respite worker, right? And so their access to things for them to be sexually attracted to are very much minimized. They have this fishbowl situation, and then we're kind of shocked that they like the EA. Well, like again, like if the EA is attractive to them, and that's the person that's with them all the time, and they're not allowed to go anywhere else, and they're not allowed to approach anybody else, we're setting them up for that situation. So they don't have a lot of access. Youth seeking intimacy outside the family unit, but not sure how to achieve this. A lot of our younger guys almost sometimes feel like they are betraying their family unit by wanting to reach out and branch out, because they've been in such an insular situation where, you know, mom and dad mean so much, brother and sister mean so much, and everything is about that when sometimes they have interests outside of that, it can be really difficult for a family to say this person is trying to find an organic person outside of us. And how to communicate that can be very difficult, especially when words are very hard to put into that. Self-stimulation is not taught or difficult to teach, resulting in frustration behaviors. So a lot of individuals who have less verbal ability, we might not ever walk through the process of actually how to masturbate. How do you reach ejaculation? And ejaculation can be very important. And we get a situation where there's no ejaculation, there's a lot of frustration, or orgasm for females. We can get in a situation where somebody is trying to masturbate, doesn't know how to get there, and then we're in this sticky situation where we're not sure if that's happening or not. The person can be more and more frustrated and trying to reach something that they can't really grasp and can't put into words, but then we don't really have a system as to how to teach. How do you teach masturbation, right? And I know that probably some of you might be cringing inside every time I say masturbation, and that's okay. I know all of us will have varying levels of comfort. But the reality is that we're kind of left to sort of sink or swim in that area, all of us, about go figure it out, right? And some of us, you know, you might learn faster or earlier or whatever. For some of our folks, it's really a challenge, and it's really sad sometimes, because you can see them working towards trying to achieve that. And there's just nobody there to say this is how it's done, right? And then there's been lots of situations where parents will come and say, but what if they start masturbating and then they keep doing it all day long because it is so fun? And I can't say that there hasn't been cases where somebody has masturbated 100 times per day. That has happened, right? But what's going on there is quite different about why they might be masturbating that many times, right? And so often we try to say, you know, masturbation, you know, for a teenage male especially, we have a nice wide variety, a good range of what's normal. And I think we have to turn to typical males sometimes and say, when you were 16, when you were 21, how many times were you masturbating a day? And often that's where, like, the reality, people will come out and say like 3 or 4 times. And so that could be on a lower end for some folks. And so when we kind of think to our guys where they might be masturbating, you know, many more times per day that we're not comfortable with, I'm kind of always trying to bring people back to say, okay, but the urge and the desire are still there and are typical for his body and his brain. So how do we fit that into a normal day, and how do we provide context around that? So I think the too much situation, it's muddy waters, but on average, we don't see a ton of people over masturbating. We see it as a phase that they grow through, and then it becomes part of their normal life, and that we just do training and teaching around it to provide context and structure. Some of the other challenges that we face are differing levels of ability when relationships develop. So what is consent? This is a really tough one. And I've seen lots of couples get together who have a developmental disability. It could be autism spectrum disorder and an intellectual disability. It could be a genetic disorder and a brain injury. And it's as two families, it can be very difficult to figure out who has consent to do what ability do they have to provide consent, how far can it go, what is everyone's comfort level, and are we being too patriarchal? Are we being fear of all possible harm at all costs? So I think there's lots of nuances there, but that often we see lots of I found in the mild intellectual disability range, or the mild ability range, for women especially, there's a lot of people that jump in and say, are they being victimized? And that's a really important question, because consent and coercion can be a very big part of sexual relationships. So I don't have any great, mind-blowing answers for today, but I just recognize that for many folks, as soon as we start talking about relationships, it might pop into your head that, how much consent can that person actually provide for the consequences? Challenges, not understanding the subtle social rules of engagement. This is for all of us. We know this is no easy business. Trying to connect with somebody, whether it's for a friendship or for sexuality, there are very social, subtle rules about how it's going to go down, whether you're successful at it, can you sustain it? And for many of our folks with ASD, these social rules just keep changing. So a rule that's okay in grade 7 is not okay in grade 11. And a rule that is okay with this person is not okay with that person. And that's very hard stuff to try to educate about, because it's those social nuances which our folks that's one of the challenges that they face, of trying to understand that gray area of social interactions. Sorry. Other ones that we have, this is more Jessica Jones on the team, Dr. Jessica Jones, youth having no sexual education and possibly resulting in issues with the law. Is it what we've actually come across a number of cases where there has been no attempt to provide any sort of sexual education, and then the individual, the youth, takes it on their own accord. I'm going to go behind the shed and I'm going to go figure this out, and I'm going to figure it out with my friend over here that might be a couple years younger. And for them, the couple years younger doesn't make any sense, because they're a friend. It's not about whether they're 14 or 17 or and because they haven't learned some of the rules around that and had that reinforced consistently, they can get themselves into a situation where it could have been a consensual act of exploration of sexual touching, but because the age differences or the ability to consent is not there, then issues with the law can come into play. And I think we've seen a number of people where education was so very much lacking. And when you really dig into it and their understanding of what those terms meant and what they were doing, they were very much just exploring. And really, we had maybe poor supervision on our hand, and maybe we just didn't want to think that they were sexual beings at that point. And then, unfortunately, we do deal a lot with youth who have trauma and sexual abuse histories, and that's quite a different situation where we're very much coming at it from a trauma-based perspective, and sexuality is definitely can be skewed in that point, and trying to help them cope through that and recover from it, but also trying to recover their own sexual being outside of that incident. So that's no easy feat. And again, that's definitely a different topic than today. So these are sort of, I'm recognizing my time's already ticking by. So I'll just buzz through these things. Overall, masturbation, super normal and okay. And youth with, I just would say our youth can often sometimes pair masturbation with a particular visual stimulation. It could be a texture, it could be an environmental situation that they've learned. And so I would only say for parents is that pairing, as soon as those urges are, even exploration of what's going on down there, if there's any interest of what's going on down there at whatever age that starts, starting to pair that with, it happens in the bedroom, it happens around your bed, it happens quietly or with your door closed, right? Setting up the environmental context to help pair the task with that's what happens and where that happens. You're setting yourself up for success later down the road, right? Even if they're just touching and playing at that point and we're not getting actually to masturbation, you setting up the context can be very important. versus waiting for the moment where they find something that is stimulating one day, and it might happen in the living room, and it's with this particular, texture and this particular visual stimulation. We don't want the wrong pairing sometimes to happen. So I just always encourage parents, as soon as you're starting to see, and even just having chats about it, talking about it, right? Whatever language you can, or whatever sort of visual signs you can show that it happens in the bedroom with the closed door privately, start that as early as possible. And that's a great way to support them into independence, into their adulthood, because they'll know that's where it's supposed to happen. Masturbation levels vary. So how much is okay? That really is dependent on age, gender, situational, what's going on in their lives, how much they're occupied, how much they enjoy it, and potentially other situations like comorbidities of if there's OCDs, if there's other things there that can make that more challenging. How much is okay is definitely, I don't have a clear answer on that, but I always try to say, think about what is typical and give yourself some shades of gray over there. Like I said, teach your rules around masturbation at an early age. There's nothing to hurt to teach that context around it. And even like I said, if the masturbation is not happening at that point, you're still setting up the environmental context for it, about the rules and expectations. Trusted adults and clinicians may have to assist in teaching masturbation. This might be something where you get later in life where you're not sure if ejaculation or orgasm are happening, and that can be something where at some point you might say, I'm not sure if he knows. I'm not sure if we're reaching that point. And it's okay to call and help for that, because it doesn't just have to be mom and dad's decision to do that. And that's a big decision, right? Whether you're going to teach that and whether you think it's happening or not. So you don't have to do it alone if you get into that situation. So definitely reach out. Tools, vibrators, prosthetic vaginas, dildos, and images can be a part of a healthy adult sexual life, especially if there's not other avenues available or preferred. So I'm not saying, to your teenagers at 15, 16 that we're trying to introduce these things, but what I'm trying to say is that for our folks, transition into sexuality and adulthood happens later in life sometimes. And so it could be that you're thinking about these things for a 19, 20, 21-year-old, 22-year-old who's heading into sort of their prime of sexuality, but they're also heading into adulthood, and ways to achieve sexual satisfaction are hard for a mom or dad or a caregiver to provide. And so I always, from an OT's perspective, we're always looking for the functional thing. What's going to make this workable? What's going to make this, what are we missing here? And so I'm very much if we have it, why can't anybody have it? Right? So if people are using these things, which most of us are, why are we always holding these things back from folks who might benefit as well? Right? We just got to really question it sometimes. It might not be the right answer. You might say, should I consider it? You can consider it, and if no is the answer, that's appropriate. But I just always want to make sure that we're asking the question. And then lastly, females are rarely recognized for their need to masturbate. We rarely come back to the situation for a 19-year-old and say, is she sexually satisfied? And I think that's part of our culture, that we don't talk about female sexuality in that way. We don't reach out to women with ASD and necessarily say, how has your sex life been? So these questions are very much lacking, and we don't have a lot of knowledge about that. So I do apologize that a lot of our masturbation conversation has been about males, because this is, again, the challenges with research in female and autism spectrum disorder. Intimate relationships. This is kind of messages that we try to say from our team. This is what we consider relationships outside of the family of origin. So family of origin would really be the family that they grew up with. It's the most stable environmental sort of family members around them. Connections can also involve friendships and or sexual attraction, or just the idea. Sometimes it's just lovely to feel like you've got a beau, right? Back from the 1920s, a pen pal, somebody that you thought was thinking about you. These can be very intimate relationships, and it really is up to that person to help. We have to understand how they identify that intimate relationship and give words to it sometimes, and not necessarily what our context is. It's important for all cultures, regardless of ability, to have intimate relationships. And intimate relationships, developmentally, are with child and parent initially. And some children and some folks, adults, will not move past parent and adult sometimes, or parent and caregiver, and that's okay. We just have to recognize that intimate relationships are important. And when intimate relationships leave us or move on or loss, whether it's death or somebody moving away, those intimate relationships are very much grieved by that person and are an important part of who they are. So I always want to validate that intimate relationships are something very special outside of sexuality that sometimes we don't talk about, especially with our youth. We're just so focused on sort of the logistics of day to day. But when a lot of our kids have a lot of loss, they have lots of people come and go from their lives. And a lot of these can be intimate relationships that are very meaningful to them. Individuals with autism may have specific ideas about what they're comfortable with. I had a young male living on his own with autism spectrum disorder, and he wanted a wife because number one, that's what his church wanted him to do. Number two, that she would bear children and they would have a fruitful life. And number three, that she would be a companion for him when he grew old. And so he had very clear ideas about what a female relationship would mean to him in his life. And whether he could achieve that or not, I can't answer that. I can't answer if there's going to be a female out there that wants to be in that role, could be. But that's how he defined what an intimate relationship would mean for him. And so sometimes we have to, I even myself, I had to bring that back and go, if that's what he sees as the core meaning of what a companion would mean for him, that's not wrong. And in many cultures, that might be exactly what a companion should be. So that, we kind of have to bring a new lens to it sometimes and just recognize that they might have a different idea about what a relationship means to them. And it doesn't have to necessarily be what we have. Many have different reasons for function for wanting a significant other. There can be lots of reasons why. The subtleties of these relationships often need to be taught about how they're different. So this is where I say start your conversations early about different relationships. To give them different language and to help them understand how they can be different from a family member, right? And that can help provide context for when individuals get into high school, to how you help explain how you might interact with someone who's your sister is very different than how you might interact with someone who's your friend. But we need to start those conversations early versus just waiting till someone's in the situation in a classroom full of girls or boys, and we haven't really talked about that sense that all friends are not friends, and all everyone's not an intimate relationship, and how the differences are. And it's a hard conversation, and I'm not saying you just have it all at once, but I think the subtleties are important, that we just try to put some labels to it. And intimate relationships are very important to a person's understanding of sense of self. So I just really want to echo that we very much tread lightly with intimate relationships, and we definitely don't talk about them enough in the context of individuals with ASD, because we assume that all social relationships don't matter, when it could be absolutely the opposite true, that some very key relationships mean everything. And do we give them as much thorough I guess consideration when we're talking about what those relationships actually mean to that person? So when should you start addressing sexuality in youth? So these are just my tips. Start introducing language and expectation and rules before the urges really start, before the hormones get ahead of us, as early as you can get to it, but do it developmentally in a way that you feel there's going to be a level of understanding, right? So I'm not saying have these, big complex discussions about consent. One of the most difficult things to have to help explain, because it requires theory of mind, right? Of what somebody else is thinking and putting yourself in their shoes, and that's very difficult. So, but I'm just talking about, let's get the language out there. I really encourage people to find a trusted mentor to explain and create context. The sex conversation, sometimes mom is just not the best messenger, and sometimes dad isn't either. So if you have somebody that is sometimes it's someone who's a bit older than that individual, could be an older brother, older cousin, an older anybody in the family that that person has a trusted relationship, you trust that they're going to talk about things appropriately and give the right values and messages that your family believes in. Try to connect that connection that they can go to them, and that person will come to that, to your child as well, so that you've got an avenue of getting the goods sometimes. Because if we're just relying on mom and dad, those communication systems aren't necessarily supposed to be that open, and we might not be getting what we really need to know, and that person might not be learning what they absolutely need to know. Acknowledge that relationships may already mean more to your child than you realize. I think this is probably every parent in the world, that you don't really want to think that your child has moved on from you. And sometimes we're kind of quick to, well, that was a friend that was there for a couple of months and they don't really talk anymore, or he kind of liked that person before but he doesn't anymore. I think sometimes we need to put some more thought into that and recognize at each of those stages there's a reason why we attract to certain people, and it's meaningful for us in sense of who we are and what we believe in ourselves. So really take a look at those relationships, and don't be cavalier if your child is actually engaging with somebody, and I would hope that that person's not cavalier with your child's feelings either. Create rules and context and an environment about where and when it's appropriate. So start that early, and that will just only serve everybody, to everyone's benefit in the end. Try to find out who they are attracted to. This is where, sometimes we find out that somebody is homosexual, and we only find out when they're 25 that they've been attracted to a different gender, or than what they've were assumed to be attracted to. And then we're like, oh, it makes so much sense, right? Why she was having so many issues with her peers. She was actually very much attracted to one of her peers, and they got into conflict about it, and she was very jealous about it. And you start to then realize everything that we've put into our understanding, and we didn't even ask whether she was attracted to males or females. So I think we've got to, re-switch our lens here and really come at it from, we don't know who the person is attracted to. Use outside resources to help guide you through the education. There is actually a lot on sexuality and training. The one that I've left you here for today, I think, is a great one. It's got lots of great pictures. And I know some of you are going to get squeamish when you see it, because even I looked at it and thought, whoa, I don't know if like my parents would have showed me that. But my parents tried to teach me a little bit about sexuality, but they definitely didn't get to the crux of things. So I think now in today's society, with iPads and pictures everywhere and lots of different exposure avenues, this is a great little guide to pick and choose exactly the pictures that you'd like to show that would be targeting what masturbation would look like for a female, what masturbation may look like for a male, what sexual intercourse would look like if you're trying to actually explain what intercourse is. Don't assume that the school system is teaching them what they need to know. This is something that I think, I don't know, sometimes it feels like we're all putting out fires, right? You're just dealing with the issue at hand sometimes, and it could be the EA has changed this month, or the teacher's gone on leave and they're having a hard time, or COVID hits, and now we're getting no sexuality training. I sometimes hear that a lot, that, well, whatever they've learned in school, that's what they've learned. And then I go to the school and I say, what do they learn about sexuality? They haven't learned anything in sexuality. We've been doing cooking, or we've been doing transportation, which are very important things. So don't leave it to that, because I think that's when, we run into problems, because they're still moving ahead. They're still developing. They're still progressing. They're still wanting sexuality. They're still wanting intimate relationships, whether we've taught them or not. Take hints. If terms are being repeated, investigate where they're coming from and what they understand. So this is a big one where lots of words are out there. So I have a young fellow who likes to say the word rape. He likes to say things that he's heard on YouTube about doing this to a person or hurting this person in a certain way. And his comprehension is very little. Does not understand that those words actually mean what they mean. And when you test for comprehension, just knows that it causes everyone to freak out, right? That the reaction is massive when he says those words. But this would be a good sign if you're starting to hear words that it's not being introduced by you or someone in your family. it's important to dig in and say, where is that coming from? Because that's a good sign to you that there is extra sexuality knowledge coming in, and it might not be true knowledge, and your child might have a very, you know, shallow understanding of it. But that's when we've got to really jump in and say, let's give the education that's really important here. Let's make sure that we have the right terms for things. Let's make sure that what they can know, they are provided with and reinforced with. So start at the beginning, start with naming body parts and pictures and what they do. Explain what happens. So cause and effect, you got to get into the nitty gritties for some of these things, and not be shy. Use pictures to show these interactions. And in that guide, you'll see lots of different pictures, like I said. Explain appropriate interactions. So adults with adults, consenting adults, safe situations, how to report when something's wrong. And again, like I said, you'll know best about how far to delve into some of these issues depending on your child's level of interest in sexuality. Continue to touch base with your child regarding sexual and intimacy every month. So whether you're talking about sexuality or relationships, I think touching base consistently and reinforcing what your family values are and what your understanding of this, and also allowing them to let you know what they believe and what they think is right and what they want. I think getting open those channels of communication is a great way to start off as early as you can and keep it going. And just always, your personal family values and culture are important in relaying your expectations. It does not mean that your child will meet or value them. And that is kind of for any person, any parent, right? We can have all these expectations about what we think sexuality or relationships can look like. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's what your child is wanting or what they see for themselves. And so we kind of have to do this together and make the pieces fit in the best way that we can. But recognize you come with your own biases. You come with your own hangups. You come up with your own teaching and understanding of sexuality and relationships based upon what your parents taught you. And so we can always learn more, and we can always be more open. And asking for help is never a bad thing. Tools that can help: visual schedules for the environment, time of day and process for cleanup. Sometimes we'll have sort of a masturbation schedule that lays it out for, this is step 1, step 2, step 3, to help make sure that it's done in a way that, you know, you can kind of live with each other. Some parents and caregivers have used condoms or rags to help with cleanup. And that can be a way of introducing that into a masturbation schedule, just to help, help with reality of living with a young adult, right? Don't be afraid to use visuals at an appropriate age. So if you're having a hard time explaining something, or if you're seeing something that you know that they're already interested in, it's better to be on top of something versus them searching for it on the internet themselves. Monitor internet websites carefully to ensure harmful materials not being accessed. You use published resources. Again, transitioning to adults will take many years, so have a trusted mentor or friend if you can, and connect with your youth with others so they can explore relationships outside of the family of origin. And I know probably all of you are, you know, in ways trying to reach out to help build organic social circles, right? And it's really hard with COVID right now. You might have lost some of that connectiveness with the families around you that might support you. Hopefully after COVID, I always encourage, you know, the more that our adolescents and our young adults get out there to expose themselves to other people, to other situations, the more that they have options for trial and error and failure. And failure is not bad. Failure is not bad in every situation. Failure is good and is part of the life experience. So we want our youth to have a crush on somebody, and we want them to maybe have their heart broken, and we want them to meet somebody who they fall in love with, and we want them to be able to move past that if it doesn't work out. And we want them to be hopeful for whatever they want in life. So that's kind of also, don't be afraid to get out there and to encourage sometimes boyfriend and girlfriend or boyfriend and boyfriend, and just create context around it, right? You guys can go out to a movie together and this is how it's going to look, and here's how we're going to behave, and here's how we're going to do this. There's lots of ways to encourage it without saying the sky is falling and now we're pregnant and the whole world's going to blow up, right? And that's where we really were 20, 30 years ago. And we just kind of try to move it forward in baby steps. Last thoughts: sexuality and intimacy are normal. Prepare your child to want varying levels of these things. If we don't teach them, that they will learn from others, or they will learn the easiest way, or they might not learn at all. And that can lead to a lot of troublesome situations. Your child may not have the same sexual patterns as you do, and your patterns may not meet their needs either. Preventing sexual misconception and misunderstanding is an ongoing education. Trial and error are a reality. Often companionship relationships are very satisfying to individuals without the need to develop more sexual interactions. I've got lots of people that I've met that have very, very rich companionship relationships that are very meaningful to them. And they look very different than the relationship I'm in right now. Doesn't mean that they're any less meaningful to them than mine is to me. Creating appropriate outlets in youth enables more independence and capacity in a person's adult life. The more that we foster this and do this in an appropriate way and create the habits and routines, the more likely when someone's ready to kind of fly the coop, that they've got those habits and routines already in place. And please seek help if your child's having difficulty with sexuality and intimacy that interferes with their day-to-day functioning. There absolutely is resources out there, and there's absolutely people that we're not shy about this. And if you just need a little guidance or a little bit of help with thinking things through, we're out there, and we're happy to help. So here's my contact info. And then this is the last resource. I just really wanted to point: the Sexuality, Puberty and Adolescence. This printout here, this link, is the really good sexuality package that I would really encourage you to print out, go through as a family, and pick out the topics that you really want to dig into. Pick one topic every 6 months that you really kind of want to delve into and kind of explore and reinforce multiple times, and then maybe move on to the next stage if you feel that they're ready. So I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who showed up at 7 o'clock at night and hung in there for the whole hour. That's very impressive, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today.